Hello and welcome. I'm delighted tonight to be talking about a remarkable man, and it's probably a story of self-improvement. A man who started in quite humble origins, but for over 30 years he taught in the fine art department in Reading University. He wrote over 25 books. He was an eminent artist, a great and passionate printmaker, and of course, he's perhaps best known as a very distinguished ornithologist and a brilliant bird artist. But he was also a very gentle and loving family man and an inspiring and wonderful teacher. But as I say, he started from relatively humble beginnings, and he was born in 1867. His father was a carpenter and a cabinet maker. But sadly, his father suffered very badly from asthma, and so the family moved to Godalming in Surrey, where Alan Seaby spent most of his growing up years. Sadly as well, his father died when Seaby was only 13 years old, and his mother had to support the family by dressmaking and working extremely hard, bringing up the family on her own. And here we have Alan Seaby as a relatively young man in 1898. And he's a very sympathetic and sensitive-looking fellow. He was very grateful. Obviously, his mother worked very hard to bring up the family with her dressmaking, but she recognised from an early age that he had a great talent for drawing. And one of his school teachers said that Alan himself would have actually made a very good teacher and encouraged him in that way. And so he actually went on a scholarship to a teaching training course, and in 1888 he qualified as a teacher. And he moved to Reading. And in Reading he taught in a number of schools, but in particular in 1892 he was at the Central Boys' School, which later became the Catesgrove School in Reading. And here we have a rather lovely photograph, and you can see Seaby there on the right as a young man. He was an assistant master, so it's the gentleman on the left looking rather stern who was actually in charge. But this is where Alan Seaby started his teaching career. And not long after, in 1897, he married a lovely lady called Ada. And here they are together. But here is a Christmas card that Alan Seaby drew a few years before they got married, when they were simply engaged. And it's obviously Ada cutting mistletoe, but she's using a rather vicious-looking machete, which I've always thought was a little odd, but there we are. There's their first Christmas card. Anyway, whilst he was teaching, Seaby also went to evening classes for self-improvement at an art school in Reading under the direction of a man called Dawson Barkus, who is one of the artists. And here we have a picture of his great Aunt Annie, which he painted in 1900, which I have to say has a feel of the influence of Sickert. I think it's pretty obvious. And this art school, which was run by Dawson Barkus, was a school of science and art in Valpy Street in Reading, which had been started in 1860. But in 1892, it amalgamated, sort of got consumed by the Oxford Extension College, which we all know, some of us know, eventually becomes the beginnings of Reading University. And it's notable that Seaby, as well as actually sort of going there for extra classes, he is listed as an assistant teacher. So by now he's beginning to be recognised as an artist. And in 1895, he's awarded an Art Master's certificate, which meant that he was fully qualified as an art teacher. And in 1899, he was appointed full-time teacher in the Department of Fine Art in that college, which, as we have said, eventually becomes Reading University. Now, his director was a very fascinating man, an extremely famous artist at the time, one of the leading artists of the period, a man called Walter Crane, who was director of the course then. And Walter Crane is a very influential man. He was a great friend of William Morris. And here we have a design that he did for the Kelmscott Press in 1894. And it's the story of the glittering plane. And Walter Crane is responsible for a rather beautiful woodcut on the right-hand side. So he was a very eminent artist, very well known. And I suspect that the post at Reading was something of an honorary post. I don't think he was probably the most active and hard-working of members of staff. We'll discover later on that he had an assistant that perhaps did most of the hard work. But he was an eminent artist, and here's one of his paintings called Summer, which he painted in 1895, a very romantic image. But he was also interested in Japanese woodcuts because he had a friend who was a naval officer who brought him back quite a lot of prints and handed them over to him in the 1870s. And that sort of inspired an interest in the Japanese culture, because we all know Japan was opening up at that period. And here we have one of his book illustrations, because he did many books, illustrated many children's books. And here we have one, and if you look at that very strange creature that's sitting on top of the cat, I think we can all see that as well as a Roman on the right, which seems extremely peculiar, we can see a Japanese style image. So Walter Crane was actually interested in the aesthetic of that movement, of Japanese art. And of course, this all coincides with the aesthetic movement that was happening in this country and this new passion for things Japanese. And we can see that in many artists of the period. Here we've got an image by Aubrey Beardsley, which is a peacock skirt of 1893, obviously very influenced by Japanese imagery. And here we have James Albert McNeill Whistler, called Caprice in Purple and Gold, number 2 of 1864. And we can see that this rather elegant woman has got something like a kimono on. There's a Japanese screen in the background, and she's looking very intently at some Japanese prints. And so at this period, Japanese popular prints weren't particularly valuable in Japan, were coming into this country and were influencing artists here, but also artists all over Europe. And here we have an example of such a print. And we can see the use of flat colour and the very strong designs which are going to influence, we're going to discover, Alan Seaby himself. And here we have a landscape kind of image. And here, if we look at the palette of colours, we're going to see that coming up in later images from people from this country. And here we have a very sort of classical image of a little bird and some blossoms and some flowers. Again, these are all images that are going to sort of be echoed in the work of Alan Seaby later. So that's one strong influence, a sort of setting the scene for the period and interesting all things Japanese. Now, another person who was working at Reading University, to become university at the time, was a man called Frank Morley Fletcher. Now, he studied in Paris for 5 years, and then he came back to this country to teach at the Central School of Arts. And he became what we might describe as the headmaster to Walter Crane. So I suspect that actually it was Frank Morley Fletcher that did all the hard work and covered, in a way, did a lot of the admin and saving that from Crane. But obviously when Fletcher was in Paris, he was being influenced by art movements at the time. So here we have a little picture of Morley Fletcher in later life. But as a student and as a young man, he was in Paris. And of course, he would have known images like this, which is a portrait of Monet's portrait of Zola. And again, in the background, you can see some of these popular Japanese prints that people were so fascinated by at the time. And of course, in a more popular image, here we have a painting by Van Gogh of the 1886 to 1888. And indeed, and again, he's surrounded, if you like, by these popular Japanese images. So Morley Fletcher must have been influenced by this. He actually suddenly found a real passion and interest in the technique of printing wood blocks in the Japanese style. And here's one or two of his early images. I think it sort of echoes that palette that we were seeing in that earlier image. This is the Whiston River, which he created and printed in 1911. And here is the floodgates, which date from 1899. And he was one of the leading artists in this country to really explore and get inspired and excited about this printing in the Japanese style from woodcuts using watercolors. Now, another chap that was in Reading was also part of this kind of movement, was a man called J.D. Batten. And here's one of Batten's early images. He was really a book illustrator, but also a painter. And here's a painting which now hangs in the very building that I'm talking to you from now, down in the hallway. This is called Pandora's Box, which he painted in 1918 and was presented to the university by the artist himself. But he was perhaps more known for his book illustrations, romantic and often rather grotesque illustrations to fairy tales. Now, Batten and Morley Fletcher, they collaborated on a very interesting early print called The Harpies, which they printed in 1894 to 1895. And if you look at the bottom, you can see a little note that's actually written by Seaby, because this was a proof pull that Seaby kept, and we found it in his archive after a few years ago. And it's interesting because it claims to be the first, but let's be a bit realistic, a very early example of wood cutting using watercolors to overprint to create the color. Now, it would appear that the image was drawn by Batten and the blocks were cut by Morley Fletcher. So this is quite a significant print. Whether indeed it is the first ever to be printed in Britain in this style, we can't be absolutely certain, quite obviously. But it's nice that this is Seaby's own copy. So Seaby was under the influence of these people, and he himself started to become intrigued and passionate about this style of printing. And this is one of his early prints. This is Bosham Mill by Moonlight. And again, look at the colour palette. And here we have a more local one. This is the Bridge at Burfield, which he printed in the mid-1900s. So Morley Fletcher ran a class in woodcuts, as it was called, in the university. So he was obviously already trying to pass on his techniques to a wider audience. But in 1905, he left Reading University and moved to Edinburgh, where he set up a course he taught over in Scotland. And this gave Seaby an opportunity to take over this woodcutting course and begin to teach in a wider context. In 1907, Walter Crane retired from Reading, and a new gentleman called W.G. Collingwood took over as director of the course. And Collingwood is fascinating because he at one point was an assistant to Ruskin. So there's all sorts of interesting links there. But by 1911, he had given up, and Alan Seaby became director of the course. So this is quite a huge step up in his career. Now, in 1906, the course at the University of Reading, as it was going to become, moved to the London Road campus, which we are on now. And here we have an image of the arts and crafts kind of buildings that represent the campus. This is a modern photograph of the fine art department as it is today. And here we have a picture of Alan Seaby, very close to retirement, actually standing in front of one of those sort of cloisters, if you like, the walkways that link various departments. So now Seaby is really in charge of this course. He's now teaching very heavily. And the range of activities he's involved with, this is a lovely image of the cast room. And of course, all the students had to spend at least a year drawing casts before they were allowed to do life drawing. But as well as this kind of activity in drawing classes, Seaby was also involved in modelling in clay from life. He did a course in historic styles, design as applied to crafts, book illustrations, stained glass embroidery, all of these things that he was involved with. So you can see that the course at Reading at this time was heavily based in the arts and crafts movement. One specialism that Seaby developed was teaching students to draw on blackboards, because at this point the course was really aimed at producing art teachers. So here we have a lovely class with everybody practicing their blackboard technique. And he was so experienced in this that Alan Seaby actually wrote a book about it. And here we have Nelson's Blackboard Drawing, which I find rather fascinating, as you can see. It's by Alan Seaby, and this came out in 1902. But apart this heavy commitment to teaching, he was also a practicing artist in his own right. And here we've got some of his sketches. This is a very evocative, very, very spontaneous little leaf from his sketchbook of a lovely seascape. And here we have another one where he's getting lots and lots of movement and very, very subtle tones. He was obviously very accomplished as a watercolourist. And here we have an oil painting that he did, the Steeple Place in Reading, which we think he probably painted in the 1930s. And finally, we've got a little panel that was in kind of a part of his sketching using oil paints, but it's a subject of the Farne Islands, which he painted in 1908, and we can see the little dots representing all the birds, which of course he was going to become so passionate about, because he's going to make his reputation later as a bird artist. And so if we're thinking of birds, then here we have a lovely woodcut by Seaby of a crouching cock, which he produced in 1914. And here we have Seaby himself sitting there sketching hens around him, which I think is absolutely delightful. And here we have a page from his sketchbook of showing his rapid sketches of these creatures. And I just think it shows you his draftsmanship. This is so spontaneous, so lifelike, and full of energy that you can realise that he's a great master with his drawing. And just out of interest, one of his famous students at Reading, who he taught how to print in the Japanese style with woodcuts, was Kathleen Hale, who was to later become very famous for her Land Over Pussycat books. And this is a print she made as a student, which is dated in 1917. But he was an inspirational and supportive teacher and much loved by his pupils. But, as I say, he was doing his own work. This is a rather beautiful image. This is Lapwings of 1905. And we're going to talk a bit later on about the technique that he's using, but I would like you to just note the sort of transparent washes of colour, and you can see the brush marks, which means that because the colour has been applied by hand with the brush, every single print is going to be slightly different. So every print is essentially a unique work of art, which is one of the qualities that's so special about this technique. He was so influenced by the Japanese technique that, of course, he had collected himself one or two books on how to do it, which were quite popular in Japan. There were many of these little books published showing you how you could create designs for kimonos and screens and to create the popular print. So this is a Japanese book from Seaby's library showing you images that he was being influenced by. And here we have a little bird that he did as a Christmas card. This is a gold crest. And here we have some little blossoms. So you can kind of see the influence of these how to do it books. So I'm just going to show you now a little selection of prints by Seaby in the Japanese style. Here we have another book that he had in his library. You can see his name's up there, and it's a Japanese school copybook. And here we have a trout. At least I think it's a trout. I'm not very good on my fish, but I'm going to assume it is. And here we have Seaby's interpretation of a lovely print of a trout. And we can see again the wonderful brush marks, the spontaneous application of the colour. Here we are. I think this is an absolutely super image. This is the hair, and again the brush marks in the background. But I think this is so evocative, so beautiful. A peacock, an image of Harlech Castle, and some bullfinches. So this is the kind of range of prints that he was doing, not just to do with birds, but all sorts of landscapes, architecture, all sorts of things. Well, this all brought him a considerable amount of success. He was exhibiting in Bond Street, he had some prints on show at the V&A, and in fact he exhibited with various societies in many of the cities in Europe. And here we have a lovely drawing he did of, from an exhibition in Amsterdam when he went over there. In 1906, he was awarded a medal in an exhibition in Milan. And here's his lovely bronze plaque, which he was awarded with. And at the same time, we've got to remember that the printing with woodcut in colour was a technique that was becoming very, very widespread in both this country and in Europe. So the history of this particular technique is a very complex and deep one, and there were many, many other artists that were beginning to work in the same tradition. And in fact, Seaby was very part of that culture, that group fraternity of people. And he was a member of quite a number of societies, including the Society for Gravers and Printers in colour. He was a member of the Colour Print Club, or the Colour Woodcut Society. He sat on the board of many magazines and journals that were produced by these societies. And he was a friend and a colleague of many of the other artists of the period that were working with similar mediums. William Giles, or Gillis, I'm not quite sure which way you say it, Eric Slater, John Platt, Sidney Lee, Lady Ethel Kirkpatrick, who was a Canadian printmaker. He was very well known amongst all these circles and very active amongst the societies. But he's a remarkable man because as well as doing all this, don't forget he's now teaching full-time, in fact running a course, he's now made director. He was also a prolific author. So all this time he has been writing. And in 1924, he managed to get a term off from his teaching to travel the Mediterranean. And he went to Greece, Egypt, and Italy on a big tour. And he gathered together ideas and illustrations for a book that he wrote in 1928 called Art in the Life of Mankind. This was a very ambitious, but he approached it in a very matter-of-fact way. He communicated extremely well. It was aimed at students, so he got just the right tone. It was scholarly without being too remote and tricky and academic. So he was actually we're going to discover in a minute that he wrote 3 other books in the same series. But whilst he was on this journey, he made lots of illustrations, which he then used in the book. And here we have, obviously, Ramesses from Egypt. Here we have the Karnak, I think this must be. These are all from his sketchbook. And here we have, of course, the Colosseum in Rome. So while he was sketching, he was thinking about illustrations for these books that he was going to publish. But, oh, and here we have a lovely one of Venice too, with his little notes. But he still had time for taking his full part in life at Reading University. And one of the things he was delighted to do was to run an art club and invite many prominent artists of the period to come and talk to students. And that included Paul Nash, maybe I have an image here. Eric Gill came to talk. The great art critic Roger Fry, he came. And of course, our local painter, Stanley Spencer. These are all people that Seaby knew and invited to talk to students at Reading University. But as well as the more academic side, he did enjoy himself. And here we have a student union dance of 1924, and you can see that the host and hostess were Professor and Mrs. A.W. Seaby. And here we have the inside of the dance card, which looks very heavily dominated by foxtrot and waltzes. So it's not quite like Strictly Come Dancing, but you have to imagine perhaps Seaby did get up and do the odd dance around the floor. So he had a lighter side to him, and here he has carved a little kingfisher. This was something he did just as a hobby. And here we have a lovely picture of him in his workshop, carving away. You can see the windows have actually got tape across them because it was during the war and presumably to not have any bombing. So he was also, by now, quite a prominent person in the town of Reading, and he with a gentleman who was director of the art gallery at Reading, and I'm just looking for his name. Here we have Professor Seaby talking to the director of Reading Museum, a man called Willie Smallcombe in 1930s, choosing prize winners from the very large exhibition that had taken place. So, here we have one of his last photographs at Reading University, because this is a departmental photograph taken in 1933, and it's rather lovely because you can see him being surrounded by all his students. Because in 1933, he retired officially from the university. But of course, being Alan Seaby, it didn't mean that he retired in the normal sense. He carried on working and was prolific in many ways after this. Now, of course, he could concentrate on his writing. We've already seen that he published quite a lot. In 1931, he published 3 more volumes of The Art of Mankind. He also had earlier produced in 1921 a book called Drawing for Students and Illustrators. In 1948, he published, I will just go back. This is some of the illustrations for The Art of Mankind, drawn by Seaby and used as line images in the book. And this particular image is the Silchester eagle, which has great significance to Reading. It's in Reading Museum. It was found at the Roman town of Silchester, which is currently often being dug by Mike Fulford, who's the professor of archaeology at Reading University. Anyway, and here's one of the illustrations from his Drawing for Students and Illustrators. But this is the book that amuses me. This is a book he produced in 1948. It's called Pattern Without Pain, which seems an extraordinary title. But it was really trying to show teachers that you can make incredibly engaging patterns with the simplest of items, even the end of a piece of stick, which I really think is quite a thought. As well as having contemporary pattern making, he also had a little chapter on the history of patterning itself, and this is one of his illustrations. But he was also writing for children. And here we have a manuscript of 1946 for a book called Perkis, the Charcoal Burner. And we can see this is his original manuscript with his notes and his sketches for the illustrations included. And he wrote quite a number of historical novels aimed at children. And for the illustrations, he often encouraged his family to act as models. So here we have a drawing of Robert Gilmore in Roman costume. And Robert did actually complain that he was rather forced to become a model for his grandfather for these books. But Seaby really had a great passion and love for nature. And this included spending a lot of time in the New Forest. He eventually had a little cabin built, but here he is under canvas, and this is the family camp in the New Forest. Here's one of his children peeling apples, which I think is a lovely drawing. And here we have a photograph of might have been that very camp. You can see the washing hanging on the line. He was very at home in the wild. And that led him to start a series of books for children, which really made his name and became bestsellers. And that was all about New Forest ponies. And this is one of his books, Sheltie, which is one of the most popular ones, which became a bestseller, and he produced this in 1939. And they were full of very, very sensitive and delicate little drawings of ponies and the wild ponies from the New Forest. This is interesting. He was attracting attention. This is actually a literary review of one of his books. But if you look at the bottom line of the first paragraph and the first line of the second paragraph, it says, "May I suggest that he does a like service for British deer?" Because the critic is saying he'd done so much to preserve the species of wild pony, which is one of the passionate campaigns of Seaby. He's saying, why don't you do that for some of our British deer? Which in fact he did. He took him up on that. And he wrote a book called The White Buck, which was about a deer. And he sent it to America, to Walt Disney, saying, why don't you turn this into a film? And Walt Disney wrote back saying, love the book, great idea, but unfortunately we're just making a film called Bambi, which kind of blew everything. So unfortunately he never became part of Hollywood. But here we have, again, one of his sketchbooks showing you his scribble of some deers. So this is one of his other books about ponies. This, in fact, was never published as one of the illustrations to quite a famous book for the Puffin series aimed at children called Our Ponies, which came out in 1849. But the editors decided that this image was too vicious, that the two horses looked extremely cross. And in fact, it's one male horse chasing another male horse away from a mare in the background. And this was considered slightly scandalous for young children. So it was never published. But this is the book that did eventually come out, minus that illustration. This came out in 1949. So this man is prolific. He's illustrating, writing an enormous amount of publications. But his main claim to fame, perhaps his biggest passion, and the thing that he was most knowledgeable about, was the study of birds. Oh, there's just another little picture of the pony, because this is the one I wanted to get to, which is a picture of Seaby surrounded by fishermen on the Farne Islands. And he wrote that, in fact, the gentlemen surrounding him were related to Grace Darling, that famous rescue. Now, he became quite well known as a bird illustrator. His first big commission, which was between 1910 and 1913, was to illustrate the British Bird Book, which had been written by F.B. Kirkman, which became an absolute classic and was a really seriously important book. And for that, he produced oil paintings. This is his painting of guillemots. These are really quite large. These are the largest things I ever saw him paint. But you can see his technique. He's very polished, very proficient. And here we have another one from that series. This is a black-headed gull. And during his career, he travelled all over Britain as far as Shetland to make sketches and draw and study birds. And he illustrated many other books with his skills as an ornithologist. But in 1932, he wrote his own book, and here we have the cover of it, Birds of the Air. And inside we have one or two of the little sketches that he used to illustrate it. This one is the artwork that was then photographed and used as one of the pictures with his little notes around it. He really, really studied birds. I mean, he drew them endlessly. And he did actually come to Reading Museum to look at the collections that are in the natural history section there. We're obviously now talking about stuffed birds. He really was very reluctant to draw from stuffed birds. He wanted to see them in their own habitat, moving and alive. But in order to get the correct feathering and colouring, he did actually do studies like this, which were taken from such stuffed animals. Here we have just a wing and his notes down the side. And here we have some lovely sketches. And what I really like is that he's written on the bottom, stuffed, because he wanted to be absolutely certain that any image that he hadn't taken from life should be identified, so that the viewer could tell that it had been done from a dead specimen. And here we just have some more of his lovely, spontaneous, rapid sketches taken from life. And this one obviously is of an owl. And perhaps he's most noted by the general public for the series of Ladybird books, which this is the first one he illustrated, called British Birds, which came out in 1953. And these were obviously extremely popular, and people still collect them today. And here we have a typical illustration from that book, which is rather special because Seaby insisted on showing and illustrating the egg alongside the bird that he was illustrated, which was apparently quite a new technique. Sadly, he was working on a second book, but it had to be published after his death because later in that year, in 1953, Alan Seaby died. But I'll leave you on this section with just a really lovely image. This is Alan Seaby taking his grandson, Robert Gilmore, who we perhaps all now know has died quite recently, but is one of our more contemporary famous bird artists, following on from his grandfather. Here he is. His grandfather had taken him to the National Gallery to look at paintings. So here he is on the way home, going off to Paddington for the station. So it was a very inspirational life. We can't do him justice in this very short period. He really was quite a brilliant artist, but a great communicator, a great teacher, a great writer, and in fact, just altogether an astonishingly lovely man. He wrote his own book on the process that he was using. It was called Colour Printing with Linoleum and Woodblocks, which he brought out in 1925. And now I'm just going to end with a few sequence photographs showing the technique that he was so passionate in promoting. The main thing about wood cutting is that it's done on a plank of a relatively soft wood, usually a fruit wood of some kind, using various gouges and knives to cut away the areas that you do not want to print. Having done that, you can then lay some damped paper on top of the block. But before you do that, you apply colour, watercolour, using these rather beautiful brushes, dipped into basically a paste. There's a special formula that the Japanese came up with. I often use flour paste, but it has to be more sophisticated than that, which helps to adhere the pigments to the woodblock. So you then put a dampened piece of paper on the top, and then you rub the top half of the paper with these little things called barrels, which are basic little pads covered in bamboo leaves. It's all very aesthetic. The Japanese do it almost as a ceremonial activity, but Alan Seaby was very certain that he laid out his workshop very carefully. So here's one of Seaby's drawings, pasted onto a plank of wood, ready for him to carve the image in relief. And you can see in the bottom right, we've got a little area that he's also already cut. Because you're not using a printing press, you're not doing this in vast quantities, so they would use every single inch of a plank of wood to be economical. Because you're going to lay the paper on just a particular area of the woodblock. Now this shows you one of his famous prints of a kingfisher, and I thought I'd just show you how Seaby built up the colour. Every single colour that's applied needs a separate block or a separate printing. And each time the colour is applied by one of those lovely brushes, and you'll see the sweep of the brush marks. So here we have a print, but here we have the very first colour being applied. You can see the brush marks. Then we have a grey that's been put over the top. Then we have the turquoise for the kingfisher going in. And you can slowly see this all building up. And each one of this is a separate printing. Here we have a black prop, which kind of brings the whole image together. Until I think we're almost at the end now. So that really sort of shows you the whole process. And here's one of the blocks that he would have used. You can see the relief image standing up. And here is actually one of the blocks that was used for printing the kingfisher. If you look at the top right, you can see that very first print, the solid yellow. And you can see that the kingfisher has been cut out in negative form. To the left, you can see the line block, the black printing that kind of brought the block all together. And then the bottom half, you can see all the little bits of colouring in the kingfisher itself. Because he was able to ink up an area, put the paper on, print that colour, then clean that off, and then ink up another area and place the paper on top, blah, blah, blah. Obviously, registration was a complex issue, but we haven't got time to go into that. But it's a lovely, sensitive technique, changing, adapting, using the Japanese technique in a very British way to produce a very European-looking image, but echoes and has some of the spontaneous essence of the Japanese print.